The Pontchartrain Park Pioneers Oral History Project is presented by the Center for African and African American Studies at Southern University at New Orleans and the following sponsors: the National Park Service, the United States Department of the Interior through the Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development, and the Division of Historic Preservation. My name is Dr. Clyde Robertson. I'm the director of the Center for African and African American Studies at Southern University at New Orleans. I'm also the director, co-researcher, and co-interviewer for the Pontchartrain Park Pioneers Oral History Project. This oral history project examines the lives and experiences of the original homeowners and residents of Pontchartrain Park. The Pontchartrain Park Pioneers Oral History Project's team consists of Connie Abdul Salam, Assistant Professor of History at Southern University at New Orleans; Dr. Mike Meehan, Director of Satellite Communications at Southern University at New Orleans; Ms. Frances Helena, recent graduate, Psychology, Southern University at New Orleans. Today's date is July 16th, 2021, and the time is 20 minutes after 11 a.m. Please tell me your name.
I'm Sybil Morial.
And when were you born, Mrs. Morial?
I was born November 26, 1932.
And where were you born?
I was born in Gerttown, the neighborhood near Xavier University, and only lived there 4 years when my parents bought a home downtown closest to my father's medical office.
So your father was a physician.
Yes.
Did your mother work?
My mother was a teacher before she married, but back in those days when a teacher married, they had to resign. They thought wives and mothers should be home taking care of the house and the kids.
Can you describe your childhood?
I have wonderful memories of my childhood. I don't remember much about Gerttown, our home in Gerttown, because I was 4 when we moved. We moved downtown on Morial Street, as I said, near my father's medical office. We had a huge backyard, and it was a big house. It was a very, very great neighborhood to grow up in because it was very diverse. There were whites and blacks. There were grand homes and rentals and medium-sized homes. So it was a mix of what America is. And I grew up and played with these children with no regard to that we were different, except we went to different schools. And then, of course, high school, we had to ride the bus, and that's when the distance came. We rode the back, and our white friends rode the front of the bus.
Now, what high school did you attend?
I went to Xavier Prep, and we went on the bus, 3 transfers.
So when you returned downtown to your neighborhood while in high school, your relationship with your white neighbors and friends changed?
Yes, we were still friendly, but we did not interact the way we did. When we were younger, we played circle games, we played jacks and jumped rope, and girls even played marbles. So it was a wonderful relationship. No difference because we were of different races.
Did you go to one another's homes?
I didn't go to their homes because their homes were small, and there was no place to play. And there were lots of children in these small houses. So our big backyard became the neighborhood playground. And my mother allowed it, not only allowed it, but encouraged it. And some days she would feed everybody. When she cooked red beans, she'd open the screen door in the back and call, "Plates." That means come get your plate, come up in the kitchen and get your beans. And we'd go back outside and sit on the lawn slapping away the mosquitoes while we ate our midday meal.
And so, race in your early life was certainly a consistent item. However, it was not anything that deterred you from having a relationship with
No.
Other young white children.
Except we could not go to public places together. There was a movie house, the Circle Theater, within walking distance. And we would go, but there was a white entrance and a black entrance. And we had to pass the white entrance to get around the corner to the black entrance. And we'd shyly wave to them who were standing in line. And the next day, we'd get together and talk about the movie. It was so strange, but it was our reality, so we accepted it.
So you grew up born in Uptown, grew up in downtown.
Yes.
Went to high school at Xavier Prep, Uptown.
Yes.
And where did you eventually go to college?
I went to Xavier University for 2 years. I wanted to go to another city. I wanted to know another city. I wanted to know a northern city. We had traveled as a family, and so I knew northern cities where there was no limit. You didn't have to think, oh, can I go here? Are they going to put me out? Are they going to humiliate me? Well, I wanted to go north. And we had traveled to Boston, and I was fascinated with Boston. I guess the look of it, I knew it was an artsy city. I knew there were many universities there, and so that's where I applied during my sophomore year at Xavier. My parents told me I was too young. I was young in college. They said, a couple of years and you can go. So I was accepted with full credits and junior status, and spent my last 2 years in Boston. Loved the city because I could go wherever I wanted to go, you know, to the museums and to the theater, live theater, and I just loved the freedom of a northern city.
And which university did you attend?
I attended Boston University.
Were you there at the same time with Martin Luther King
Yes,
and
Martin Luther
Coretta Scott King?
Martin Luther King was
Coretta Scott at the time.
Yeah, Martin Luther King was a dear friend. In those days, all of the black students in all of the several universities in the Boston area, MIT and Harvard and Boston College and Boston University and several others, we all knew each other through sororities and fraternities, and we socialized together. And in those days, this was the 1950s, we were on the cusp of the civil rights movement. And so we talked all the time about the possibilities, especially those of us who were from the South, the segregated South. And Martin, he was working on his doctorate at Boston University, and I was an undergraduate. But we talked about what was coming. You know, we kept up with what was going on in the courts. The Brown decision was was going on then. And we had to go to the black neighborhood in Boston, Roxbury, to get the Negro newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier and the Afro-American newspaper, to read what was happening in the courts and all over the country in terms of blacks. So we talked about the possibilities. When the Brown decision came, did we celebrate? We were thrilled, and we wondered what this meant. How would change come? What would happen? And all of us from the South, all of the students who came from southern cities, we loved the freedoms of the North, but we all wanted to go back south to the woman and to the man to be a part of the change. And of course, Martin was our leader then. He was a graduated minister, and he would preach in churches when a minister had to be out of town. And we all went to his sermons. I mean, it was almost like a social activity. The buzz in the dormitory was, Martin is speaking at such and such a church. Okay, we're going. So he was our leader. We had no idea he would be on the world stage leading all of us.
So when he did become a part of that world stage, and you had returned to New Orleans and had become a part of that world stage, did you reconnect?
We did reconnect. He came to New Orleans to speak. He hit the stage when he led the Montgomery bus boycott, which was successful. And so he was speaking all over the country. And so when I found out he was coming to New Orleans, I wrote him a letter. And I had kept up with him. He dated my best friend before he met Coretta. And she knew how to contact him, so I wrote him an invite. I said, when you come, if you have time, come to dinner. I was living with my mother then. Or come to lunch. He said, I will call you when I get there. So he was speaking at the Coliseum Arena, which was like a big gym where they had prize fights. And that's where he spoke. And so I went to hear him. His wife was expecting one of her children, and I was expecting my first. So I went backstage and talked to him. And he said, I am so sorry. I was going to tell you that I'll be free for dinner tomorrow, but the ministers have called me in for a meeting. And guess what happened at that meeting? The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was born in New Orleans at Reverend A.L. Davis's church with Martin Luther King as the leader. So I said, well, yeah, okay. I don't want to use this word, but I said that trumps Sybil Morial.
And this was 1957.
Yes.
1957.
It was. Mm-hmm.
Now, you graduated from Boston University, and did you return directly to the city?
I did not. I got a job teaching in Newton, Massachusetts, which was one of the premier, excellent public school districts in the country. And a team came to interview teachers, and everybody wanted to teach in Newton. Well, my advisor had asked me if I wanted to go to graduate school. She said, you can be my assistant and it will pay your tuition. I said, great. But I went to the interview at Newton, and there were 17 of us at first. It was shaved down to 5, and then I got a call offering, and that was, threw me into a flip because I had already had plans, and my advisor said, she said, Sybil, you need to give this some thought. You can go to graduate school later, but for you to go and teach in Newton, that's great on any level. But you will be the only black, I think, teaching. And I don't know that there are many black students even in that neighborhood. It was a big suburb of Boston. So I taught school, and I went to graduate school in the evening and on Saturday. So in 1955, I finished my graduate studies, and in the meantime, my husband, Ernest Morial, and I were dating, and we decided to marry. He was in Army Intelligence, the spy group of the Army. It was during the Korean War, but things were going on in Vietnam, and all of the men who were trained at the Army Intelligence School after they graduated, they sent them to Vietnam. So Dutch said, I'm not going to leave you and go to Vietnam. We're going to get married, and when I come back, we'll start our life. So we did marry. We married in Boston. He went to Fort Holabird in Baltimore. I joined him at the end of the school year, and we lived in Baltimore for 2 years. I taught in the public schools. It was the first year they had integrated the faculty in the Boston public schools. And there were 5 of us in this faculty of 30, 5 blacks in this, among 30, so there were 35 teachers in the school. It was a big school. So When his term was up, we returned to New Orleans. He was an attorney, and he had been practicing law with A.P. Turo, who was the dean of black lawyers in Louisiana.
Now you said you lived in Baltimore.
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Morial attended law school.
Before we got together, yes.
So when he was in the intelligence corps, he was also in law school, or was he an attorney?
He finished law school. When I came back, he was already a lawyer practicing. He finished law school in 1954, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So.
And at LSU.
At LSU, the first black. And then he came back home and resumed his practice with A.P. Turo.
After separating from the Army?
From the Army, yes.
And what year was that when you all returned?
That was 1955.
So in 1955, where were you living?
1955, we came back to New Orleans and we rented a house in Pontchartrain Park. We were looking for a house to buy, and at the time, they had not finished building on the other side of the park, which is where you and I lived. So we rented this house on New York Circle, and we lived there for 4 years, and began to look to buy a house in the park.
So you rented from an institution or an individual? An
individual had bought the house, and for some reason his wife could not come at that time. She had a job somewhere else, and she could not separate at that time, but he did not want to sell the house. So he rented it, which helped him pay his mortgage. And as I say, we were there 3 or 4 years.
Now, what year did you decide to purchase your home?
Let's see. I'm trying to think how old my children were. 1960, I think, was when, 59 or 60, which is when we purchased the home.
Now, what other options were made available to you and Mr. Morial when you returned? Fortunately, Pontchartrain Park had been created, but if Pontchartrain Park had not been created, where could you all have lived?
I don't know. When we came home, Pontchartrain Park was being built. Young families were moving in. And after we rented in that area, we were sold on raising our children there. So we didn't consider any other place. We took to Pontchartrain Park. We rented because it was a single home with a yard, with young neighbors like ourselves. And so there was no question that we would not buy a house in Pontchartrain Park.
Now, in the process of buying homes, what kind of paperwork did you pursue? I know Mr. Morial was a veteran. Did he access the VA loan?
Yes. He got a VA loan. And that's why so many young people were buying houses, because many of them were veterans and they could get the GI loan. And my husband did.
And so when you moved back, you secured your home eventually in 1960 by way of the VA loan. Mm-hmm. Mr. Morial was a practicing attorney, and were you teaching at the time?
I was teaching. I may have been on maternity leave because I had two children after we had moved. We had bought our home. But I was teaching with your mother, my dear friend Dolores Robertson.
So you were teaching at Henderson H. Dunn.
Henderson H. Dunn, which was in the Desire Housing Development.
Yes. And you, prior to that, had taught in Newton.
Among middle and upper middle class children. And at Dunn, it was those people who were not well off at all. Yeah, many of them on food stamps and all kinds of assistance.
Now, were there, when you moved into Pontchartrain Park, were you familiar with the wranglings about Pontchartrain Park being segregated? For example, attorney A.P. Turo was opposed to the creation of Pontchartrain Park. Mr. Morial at the time worked very closely with Mr. Turo, but lived in Pontchartrain Park and was accepting of the segregated status. Did that create a conflict between?
Not for us. We wanted that neighborhood. We wanted families like ourselves, young marrieds with children. And I did not think living in a segregated neighborhood would be adverse to my children. I thought it might be healthy for the development of their self-esteem. Now, they eventually went to the Catholic school, which was located in the white neighborhood. There was a white neighborhood, Gentilly Woods, big, and then there was Pontchartrain Park. And so my children had to navigate getting back to the park because there was some resistance to integrating the Catholic schools, and their parents passed it on to their children. And if you remember, there was a ditch that separated Gentilly Woods from Pontchartrain Park. And when you got over the ditch to Pontchartrain Park, you were safe.
Can you recall any of those incidents? Did your children relate with you some of their experiences?
You know what? They did not. Hardly at all. But years later, they told the stories. Jacques about how he had to run home.
Yeah.
Because the same boy would chase him and call him the N-word. I said, well, why didn't you tell me? He said, well, I handled it. What were you going to do? So they learned to handle that adversity without coming to us. And I said, well, I hope that if you do need us, you will tell us. They said, okay.
We're going to return to that conversation in a moment. When you finally purchased your home in Pontchartrain Park, what was your reaction? Was it excitement and buyer's remorse?
It was exciting. And one additional appeal was that the house was across the street from the park, from the golf course. And I could look out my windows and see my children playing over there. And I loved that it was a nice, but I also loved that there were many children their age. They had children to play with. And the parents, the homeowners, took care of their property. You know, they kept the grass cut. They planted plants, and they kept everything clean. And they were so proud to own a home, as Dutch and I were.
Let's return to the concept of Pontchartrain Park being a safe haven for you, Mr. Morial, and more importantly, your children. Can you explain that a little more?
Well, there were friends of my parents who commented, and they knew we grew up in a mixed neighborhood, a diverse neighborhood. And they said, do you want your children to grow up in an all-black neighborhood? Don't you want them to have a more diverse experience? And we agreed that, number one, we were all young families, homeowners, had the same interests. Many of them were veterans. And I thought it was healthy, and that outweighed my concern about them being separated from white people whom they would have to get along with eventually.
We talked about the park being an advantage, the park itself being an advantage. Were there other advantages to raising your children in Pontchartrain Park? You mentioned the fact that there were other children in the neighborhood. Um, what other types of advantages? There were churches, there was a university in the community.
Yes, there was Southern University that had just opened uh, around the time we moved there. There was the public school, Cog Hill School, but the Catholic school was in the white neighborhood, St. Gabriel. And so if we wanted them to go to Catholic schools, they would have to go into Gentilly Woods. And the first year that the schools were integrated, we registered my two oldest, Julie and Mark. And there were not many blacks that were there in the first years. But there were differences. The children brought the ideas of their parents. It was ingrained in them. But they got along for the most part. And the teachers were willing. It was a Catholic school, and they knew that this was the Christian thing to do besides, it was following the law. My children went to the Catholic school. They had friends who went to the public schools in Pontchartrain Park, and that was good. So I was, as an afterthought, I was glad that they did go to the integrated schools, the Catholic integrated school, St. Gabriel, to have that experience, even though some of it was negative. It wasn't overt, it was subtle, but it was there. You know what those subtleties can do to young people.
Now, we talked about your children's experiences. In Gentilly Woods, there was also the shopping district that we called the front.
Yeah, absolutely.
There were two big box stores, Maison Blanche on one end, Sears on the other, and in between, grocery store, restaurants, and the like. You had to traverse Gentilly Woods as well.
Yes.
Not by foot, but by car.
Yeah.
But you had to interface with people at the front. Did you encounter any experiences?
Not that I recall. I guess there were maybe snubs, but nothing overt, nothing verbal that upset me. In fact, sometimes white people spoke to me, not that they knew me, even from school, but just, nice people who were kind of polite. Good morning, hello. Talk about the weather. They didn't know me from Adam, and I didn't know them, but they knew I probably came from Pontchartrain Park.
Any neighborhood friends did you develop lifelong friendships with people around whom you lived?
I did. Many in Pontchartrain Park, but I had one friend early on, Claire Katner, who had a lot of children who were at St. Gabriel. And two of my children were in the same class as two of her children. And her husband worked for the city. I think he was in city planning. And she invited our family to dinner. And she had 6 children, and at the time I had 3. And so we went into Gentilly Woods, and she told us this story. She said, my neighbor down the street, I just want to kind of prep you. I'm not responsible for what my neighbors say or do. I'm welcoming you to my house. But she said the neighbor down the street told her children in the presence of the woman, her own children, in the presence of Claire's children. Now, you be nice to those little colored children, but don't play with them. And she said, of all things, how can she teach that negative thing to her own children? What are you saying? Don't play with them. Why? What's wrong? And so, but she was Christian enough and brave enough to invite all of us to dinner. And so we came into the neighborhood, and so we're lifelong friends. And right now she lives right up the street in that apartment building. And so sometimes we go to church together. So there were good people who were willing to take risks, and by risks I mean snubs from their neighborhoods, their neighbors with whom they had been friendly. But she didn't mind. She didn't mind that. She did what her conscience told her she should do for her children.
Now, right across the street from your home, as you stated, was the playground. But it was not only a playground, it was a NORD, New Orleans Recreation Department, site where structured, organized athletics occurred. Did any of your children participate in the NORD program at Pontchartrain
Yes,
Park?
that's another reason why I loved the park so much. Mark was on the Biddy basketball team, the NORD basketball team, and he was also on the, what was the football team? Was it the Mid-State?
No, it was the NORD 85 through 120 pound football.
But did it have a name like the
Patriots, the
Yeah.
Pontchartrain Park Patriots.
So Mark participated in both of those sports, which happened right there in the park.
Literally across the street.
Yes,
from
I
your
could
home.
look out my window and see him. And he was a place kicker, and when he was in middle school, he would come home from school, drop his books, get his football and his tee, and go across the street and practice kicking until he got tired, came in and ate, and then he was ready to do his homework. But that was his day structure.
Do you remember the game, Mark's last game as a Pontchartrain Park Patriot before he went off to high school?
I don't. I only remember the champion basketball player. It was a Biddy basketball team. Yeah. And I was talking to Mark last week, and he was reminiscing on the NORD football and basketball experience he had.
The reason I queried you is because in that game in which I played, we were beating Lakeview, one of our rival teams. And of course, Pontchartrain Park was the one of two black teams in the Lakeshore district of NORD. Mm-hmm. We were playing a rival team, well-equipped, well-endowed, Lakeview Vikings, and we were beating them handily. Mm-hmm. And in that game, Mark Morial did something no other NORD player did before or since. He kicked a 20-plus yard field goal.
I remember that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think there was a write-up, mm-hmm. if I could remember, in the Times-Picayune, shortly thereafter.
Yes.
What is remarkable is that we never practiced it. He only practiced kicking from far distances, as you just described. But in that game, everything fell into place miraculously. The snap was good, the hold was good, and the kick was through. 20-plus yards.
Wow.
Right now, NORD doesn't even play with goals. There's just the goal line. So there's no way for people to kick that far. But that was done in 1969, if not 69, no later than 71 or 72, which was remarkable then and would be remarkable now. Were you a Booster Club member?
No, I was not. And I regret that. And Dutch, my husband, was so busy during the Civil Rights Movement. He was president of the NAACP, and he was a practicing attorney. And of course, because he was with A.P. Turo, he was involved in much of the legislative change when Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley and the team from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund came down. They were strategizing how to get the state to conform to the national, the result of the Brown decision, the national mandate to desegregate the schools. So he was busy. He was gone all the time, and he regretted that. And of course, I was home with 3 other children, and so I talk about, we talk about it now because his son is a really great basketball player in New Jersey where they live. He's now a freshman in college, but Mark went to every single game. He said, I'll arrange my schedule. He says, because I remember Dad was too busy to make all of my games. And just last week we were talking about that.
Now, let's get back to the civil rights issue. While you were living in Pontchartrain Park, Mr. Morial made history by becoming the first African American elected to the state House of Representatives since Reconstruction.
Yes.
In Pontchartrain Park, there was Mr. Morial and you. There was Dr. Adams, the podiatrist, who was a major civil rights stalwart. There was Dr. Mitchell, the optometrist, who was a civil rights stalwart.
Yeah.
What was it about Pontchartrain Park, do you think, that gave rise to these activists?
I think they were all professional people who chose to live in Pontchartrain Park, who were aware of what was happening, not only in the country, but what was happening in our state and in our city. And I think during that time, many young black women and men were involved in some way, in some small way, because this was a life changer for them and their families.
Let us talk about the women and the civil rights era, in particular the civil rights movement, that movement for integration. We had, coming out of Pontchartrain Park, several young women, very young women at the time, who were audacious enough to create a political organization which served to educate other black women and men around the city. Can you discuss
You know that well because your mother
Yes,
was a charter member.
that's right.
In my case, early on during the civil rights movement, of course it was all over the news. You know, I think that's what accelerated the activities of the civil rights movement, because everyone all over the country was seeing what was happening all over the country, as well as what was happening in their city. And so this motivated many of them to become involved. So I belonged to a women's group. There were 8 of us, and we did the typical good deeds of that time. We would have a rummage sale and give it to the orphanage. We would visit the orphanage to interact with the young women who weren't going to get out until they were adults. We were do-gooders. And then I couldn't wait for my husband to come home, because he was in the courts to tell me the real skinny on what was going on. I saw on the news. I said, okay, what happened that wasn't on the news? And I decided, I was home with 2 toddlers. And I said, well, I want to do something. But I'm limited. I'm working. I have young children, and I have a husband who is very active and not home a whole lot. So I went to my 7 friends, and said, you know, we could really make a contribution. I had a white friend from Gentilly Woods who belonged to the League of Women Voters, and she talked about that they had just gotten a grant to do voter registration. So I said, well, you think, are there any blacks in the League of Women Voters? She said, not in this neighborhood. So I said, well, let me think about joining so I can be a part of the voter registration drive. No, they couldn't take me. Why? Because it was us against the law. It was the state law that said white and black people could not meet together or eat together. And that impacted the restaurants. So we got together at my house and talked about what we would do. There were 8 of us. And your mother was one of the charter members. She was my dear friend back then. And so we educated ourselves on what the registration process was. It was very, very involved. And the intent was to keep as many black people off the rolls. So we educated ourselves. And then we selected 4 places to do what we call voter registration workshops. Black churches always welcomed us. And then we went to the Gus Homes, which was the first senior citizens federally funded apartment complex. And so one of us was assigned to each of this. We had 1 day a week where we led a workshop. And this is what you had to do to become a registered voter back then. You had to pass a citizenship test, a literacy test. You had to figure your age in years, months, weeks, and days. Now, that's not easy to do, but you can figure it out ahead of time and be ready. But if you figured it out day before yesterday, and you get there and you have this other number in mind, then you missed it. But it was a challenge to them because they had to figure out if you were wrong. So it was an intimidating experience to have to face all that to get the right to vote. But we did it. We were loyal to our areas, and we did that for several years. And then we added on. We educated ourselves. We had speakers to come and talk about the structure of the state legislatures and what their responsibilities were, the city council and what their responsibilities were. How do you get from presenting a law and getting it enacted? So we were educating ourselves so we could in turn educate others. Then we had a brilliant idea of having a Meet the Candidates session. And there wasn't much of that. Some of the old-time political organizations would do that. We did it. It was a city election. Moon Landrieu was running for mayor. We did it at a labor union hall. There weren't many places we could do that. I mean, we were pretty good, figuring all that stuff out. And so there were actually 101 people running in this election. And that sounds crazy, but there are a lot of little parochial positions. So after we set it up to have it in the Laborers Union Hall and have some refreshments, light refreshments, I said, well, suppose there were no black candidates. I said, suppose they don't come. We have the people and they don't come. So I knew Moon Landrieu, because Dutch and Moon knew each other during the early years. I said, Moon, this is what my organization did. You think they'll come? He said, Sybil, I don't know, but I'll be there. I don't know. So I said, that was good enough, even if he came. He was running for mayor, and we could ask him some questions like, are you going to appoint blacks to city commissions? What are you going to do for this and that? Almost everybody turned out. They were curious about these young women who had the nerve to have this big Meet the Candidates session in a big union hall. They must be expecting a lot of people. So I think that really gave us the exposure that we were serious, and we were young women who had children and jobs. And so our organization thrived all through the years. Your mama with me all the time, every step of the way. And guess what happened? Katrina came. And all of our members dispersed, left to go to other cities. So many years later, when people came back, some restored their houses. There were 6 of us who I contacted, the last presidents and so forth, the previous president. I said, do you think we can bring this together? We need to find a couple of young live wires because this should not die. So we tried. Two of the women had grown daughters. And so we tried to pull it together, and we just couldn't pull it off. But guess what? Right before Katrina, we had gotten a big grant from the city to do more voter registration and voter education. And that money was sitting in the bank. I think it was $20,000. So, you know, the banks were all upset too because their people were gone. And one of our members, our past presidents, was a successful businesswoman. She said, well, you know, our money was there, and it's been 8 years since Katrina. I'm going to find out, I'm going to get our interest on that and make it grow. And she really had to do some stuff because she had to work with the bank to figure out what our interest would be. And we ended up getting, I think it was close to $30,000. And this is what we decided to do. Since we couldn't pull the organization back together, we decided to do 2 scholarships, one at Dillard and one at Xavier. We would divide the money in half, and it would be an endowed scholarship, which means you could add more money through the years. And we felt that that was the right thing to do. And the only restriction we had on it was that it would go to a woman. She didn't have to be a political science major. She didn't have to be anything else but a woman who needed money. In the meantime, I had talked to Dr. Norman Francis, who was president of Xavier, to see if this little money was worth it. He said, absolutely. He said, sometimes when we're putting a package together, $3,000 can make the difference. And we thought with $20,000 at each one of those universities, it could yield in interest. They would only spend the interest. Could yield maybe $5,000 if the market was good. So every year I get a report from Xavier. The corpus is growing, and they're giving, they let me know how much they're giving to a woman each year. So all was not lost. And some of our original members are gone, like your mother, but they left a great legacy.
What year did you create LOG, the Louisiana League of Good Government?
1963.
1963.
Right in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement.
1963, and how old were you all at that time?
Let's see, we were not 30 yet. Maybe 28, yeah.
So very young women.
Very young, who worked.
Yeah.
And who had little children. And this is what we said, well, we got a babysitter to go to a party or to go out to dinner. We could get a babysitter once a week to go do this, 3 hours.
Many of the women I interviewed for this project were housewives, but very many women in Pontchartrain Park were not. Very many women, like yourself, like my mother, were professional educators or professionals in some other realm, and who actually worked and assisted in purchasing the home, maintaining the home, and the like. In fact, one of the ladies, Mrs. Slack, identified the fact that she was responsible for paying the mortgage every month. And she did so as a result of her job. So LOG, actually through these scholarships, LOG is still in existence.
Yes.
So from 1963 to 2001 and beyond.
2021.
2021, thank you. Now, how long did you and your family remain in Pontchartrain Park?
We remained in Pontchartrain Park until 1972. two. We left because we had had a fifth child, and we didn't have any room. And Mark says this in his book. He was pointing out that we lived middle class modestly. And he said our house had 3 bedrooms, one for the 2 girls, one for the 2 boys, and here comes my last one, a girl, whose crib had to stay in our bedroom, and that was not going to work much longer. So we had owned this lot for several years and could not afford to build on it. So we started planning and kind of getting our money together and seeing how we could do this. And so we left Pontchartrain Park when my youngest was 3 years old in 1973. And I was saddened to leave Pontchartrain Park because I still had 2 young girls, and I would have loved for them to grow up in that very healthy and nourishing neighborhood. But in this neighborhood, there were lots of children, and so they had that good experience.
So you left the park because this provided you a larger
Right,
area.
we needed more room.
And what part of the city is your current home in?
This is in Gentilly, on the fringe of Gentilly, in the 7th Ward, which is a political designation. And we're on the bayou. When we bought the property, all this area was just being developed. They were just putting in a sewer line and a water line and the streets and so forth. So there were no houses yet. They were selling the lots, and we bought this one on the end and just held it until we could get our money together.
Now, your parents lived next door.
Yeah, 3 doors down, yes. And they bought that as a result after they realized we were buying this house. My husband told my father, there's a lot right up the street that's for sale. Now, my dad loves to fish. Not that you could do a lot of fishing here, but it just had that appeal. And he likes to tinker and fix things and so forth. And so he was looking forward to this kind of area, and my mother also. And so they built before we did because they had money to buy, and we were still, gathering our assets to build. So it was wonderful to have them down the street. My children could, just go down the street to see their grandmother and grandfather.
Now, before you moved in 73, right after you helped create LOG, the Louisiana League for Good Government, in 1963, there was in 1965 Hurricane Betsy. You lived through Betsy
Yes.
in Pontchartrain Park.
Yes.
How did Betsy impact upon you, your family, and the neighborhood?
We flooded. The whole neighborhood flooded. We didn't have a lot of high water. We had about 10 inches of water in our house. But when we drove out after things had settled down, we had to get a boat to go to my house up the street, the flooded street, to see what Betsy had done and what we needed to do to get back if we wanted to get back and so forth. So this was a real tragedy for us, but more of a tragedy for others who could not come back from that.
Did you all have insurance at the time?
We did. We did have insurance. But it was not enough. The flood insurance increased, the coverage increased after Betsy.
My father had said that because of Hurricane Betsy, many of the homes in the neighborhood were modernized. Mm-hmm. For example, central air was added into our home. Prior to that, we had a big, huge ceiling fan. Mm-hmm. Was that the same with your experience?
Well, we restored the house to make it livable. We closed in a screen back porch, and that was our den. And we still had in our future, building a house here. But we restored it enough to be able to live there happily, because my children had friends, because they loved it so much, because it was beautiful and peaceful, and there were children like you who were good students and who were good children to their parents. It was just such a healthy place, socially, to live.
Do you remember any of the Pontchartrain Park legends, the urban myths? For example, there was this mythical story about the lady in white. Do you recall?
I don't know that story.
Yes, the lady in white was, I think there might be some truth to it. I am sure, because Mark spent a lot of his time on the playground, I'm sure he's familiar with the lady in white. It was, supposedly, there was a lady who lived somewhere on the other side of the park near the golf course.
The old side,
the older
original
side,
side, yeah.
Still on Prentice, not Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And she would be seen at dusk with a white flowing gown and white hair blowing in the wind. And she would frighten children. I think that this was actually a person who might have had dementia at the time, or might have had a breakdown, and who was on the park, who might have been wearing a gown, whose hair was white and blowing in the wind, but was not as menacing a character as the children let on.
You know, I never heard that story.
The lady in white.
But she was mostly in the old side,
Well,
the original side?
she would
come over to our side?
from the golf course to the playground.
Mm-hmm.
And for years, just the mentioning of the lady in white in the spring and summer would clear the park for years.
You know, there was a tale like that in the 7th Ward, where if you didn't come in right at dark, the lady was going to get you. And so maybe that's what...
Might have carried over.
Yes.
Yes, the lady in white. I'm sure Mark would be familiar with the lady in white.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, because he was on the park a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a park myth. It wasn't necessarily in the neighborhoods, but on the park. And when I say the neighborhoods, in the blocks.
Yes.
But in the park, it was very real.
Let me share this with you, Clyde, and you remember it. Remember, all parents said, as soon as the streetlights go on, you better be home. Well, as soon as the streetlights ran on, I could see kids running all over to make it home before it got dark.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We were a bicycle community as well.
Yeah.
So wherever you were on your bike and the lights came on, you were hightailing it
Yeah.
home. That I could remember very well. Can you recall at this moment your lasting memories about Pontchartrain Park?
I think I've shared all that. Just young families with children were able to do it because of the GI Bill. Proud of their homes, proud of the neighborhood, because there were people just like they were who kept their property up and who were happy that their children could play outside with a little fear that anything would happen to them. It was an idyllic place. to raise children. And the fact that it was all black, it turned out to be an asset because I think it raised the self-esteem. They did not get the taunting and the idea that you're not as good as the rest of them. So I don't regret at all, even though I loved that I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood. I think that Pontchartrain Park was very healthy for my children, and moved here, and my two youngest, lots of kids in this next 2 blocks, yeah.
So in 1973, did you notice the park beginning to change?
That's when I moved.
I know, but prior to...
No, I did not notice a change because Mark was still very active on the playground. And I want to remember a legend, McBurney Knox, the coach, who really had those guys not just teaching in sports, but passing on good character to them.
Now, you moved in 73, and of course in 2005, Katrina hit. You lived through Katrina here.
Here.
What was that experience like?
Oh, it was horrible. We evacuated. All of my children were flooded. I was flooded. Monique was flooded. She had bought a house. Julie had just come back to New Orleans. She was flooded. And Jacques' roof was almost ripped off. So 4 of us were and me, we couldn't live in our homes. And we all evacuated to my daughter Cherie's house in Baton Rouge. 7 of us and a big dog. And she and her husband took us in. She had a huge house, and she had a little carriage house in the back. She could accommodate us. And they were wonderful. And Cherie's mother-in-law offered us her credit card to buy clothes because we only had 3 changes of clothes. We couldn't come back because the city was flooded. She said, go get what you need. She brought us cooked food, and she brought us fresh food. She was wonderful, as were the neighbors. The neighbors had towels and sheets and all of that. It was just a very Christian attitude at that time. Those people who did not have, great loss helped others. So we stayed there. Some of us, like 2 years, and I was there 5 years and decided these people need to get back to their routine. I mean, you love your family and all that, but this is enough. Your house had become a hotel. And so I rented a house. I had just retired from Xavier University 2 months before Katrina. So I had no reason to come back here to live. I had reason to come back and try to get my house back together. But I had not only flood, but fire. So it was going to be a major undertaking to restore my house, but I did want to restore it. This is a family homestead. I have so many happy memories. All 5 of my children were here, the older ones during the teen years, the younger ones most of their lives. So I was commuting back and forth, dealing with the contractor. Well, first, the insurance. And so Jacques and Monique came to see what the damage was. They got boots and masks and all of that, and got as far as a bridge and had to wade here to get into the house. And what they did was pulled up all the carpets and the rugs and emptied the refrigerators and threw out stuff that was gone, put it out front because they were telling you to put, if you're on an avenue, put it on a neutral ground. So when I came to meet with my insurance agent, it wasn't as bad as when they came. They had done some cleaning up. But I tell you, when I walked in the side door, I told the insurance, I said, I need a minute. Just wait, I can't talk right now. So the insurance was what I expected. I didn't have any trouble getting it, but that was not nearly enough. And I had no mortgage on this house. It was all paid for. And so in Baton Rouge, I was thinking how I could recover. And I was able to get an architect to see what, you didn't know the house, but we had walls around here. The walls were gone, so I didn't put them. It was stripped down to the studs. I didn't put the walls back up. So I've got this open look that I like. But I was coming every week to meet with the contractor. But then, I guess a month into the restoration, fire took what the water had. The water took the first floor, and the mildew crawled up the walls. The fire took the second floor and everything in it. So, furniture, no, it was all gone. So I was just intent on getting the house back together. I wanted to come back because I wanted my children to have a place to come on holidays. I do not regret. I have a big mortgage, and I do not regret restoring it because every holiday they come, even the 4th of July, I'll have something we eat outside. Outside is wonderful. Mm-hmm.
Well, you've done a tremendous job, Ms. Morial, in putting your home back together. There's no question about it. Do you have any reason to go back through Pontchartrain Park now?
I do, because I have my hair done in Pontchartrain Park. I pass my old house every time I go. That's once a week. And I have such happy reminiscences each time I go. Of course, I get a good look at what used to be my house. And all the memories come back. So it's still a wonderful neighborhood.
Are you familiar with Wendell Pierce's efforts to rebuild the park one house at a time?
Yes.
It wasn't as successful as everyone had hoped. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a great idea because I think, it's a historical neighborhood. I think it was one of the first all-black neighborhoods. I don't know if it's in the South or whatever. I mean, there were new neighborhoods coming up there, new developments, because I remember in New York there was Levittown with all the new houses, and it was that concept was spreading across the country.
Well, certainly in Louisiana, it was the first subdivision-style neighborhood for African Americans.
Yeah.
They were also pursuing this kind of development in places like Atlanta, even Jackson, Mississippi. Medgar Evans's community was just like Pontchartrain Park, very similar to it. But Pontchartrain Park is the first of its kind in the state of Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad to know that history, yeah.
Thank you, Mrs. Morial, for your participation in this oral history project. Your contribution is tremendously appreciated. Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure to share these wonderful memories with you, especially because you were a part of our Pontchartrain Park family, because your mother and I were very close.
Thank you. This has been a presentation of the Center for African and African American Studies at Southern University at New Orleans and the following sponsors: the National Park Service, the United States Department of the Interior through the Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development, and the Division of Historic Preservation.